In a fierce war between two nations, Burin Sakrisha, the proud prince of the kingdom of Sakrisha, fought fiercely with the last of the royal legions. At the moment the arrows rained down again, a warrior used his body to shield him, and that warrior's back was immediately pierced by the arrows. The exhausted warrior whispered weakly. Chili interrupted, "Don't give up." The warrior grabbed Burin's hand that was holding the sword tightly and said his last words, "Once again, raise your sword high, and please, don't stop." When he picked up the sword, Burin's eyes shone with light. It seemed like nothing could stop him. "I had forgotten the petty memories, now I am simply a sword that serves only the king." However, just then, a mage shot ice spears at him. At that time, Burin had just raised his sword, and the ice spear that suddenly shot out was something he could not avoid. At the moment that Burin fell, he could only hear the last hum of life fading in his ears. The feeling of difficulty breathing also pressed on his chest. Burin raised his eyes and stared into space in the last moments of his life. He said to himself, "I saw it." The lights gradually died out. That was his last memory. And Burin was given a second chance. When he opened his eyes again, he asked the servant next to him, "Who am I?" The servant looked at Burin awkwardly and replied, "Sir, you are the third prince by Kairos." Burin was stunned. The third prince of Kairos, Kalian, of all the people I could have become, I was back in the body of the prince of the enemy country, and Kalian's journey start here. Burin's head started to hurt like hell, and the horrifying memories of his past life came rushing back like a flood. The situation of that disastrous war, hell, yes, if there was a real hell, it would be this place. Burin tried his best with his army to defend the last line of Sakrisha. The war had claimed thousands of lives, and even Burin was starting to get exhausted. When Burin was about to give up before the rain of arrows raining down on him, his eyes suddenly opened wide in shock. It was at that moment that the brave warrior decided to sacrifice himself to protect Burin. This warrior is Kiri, the most loyal person to Burin, also the most respected swordsman in the Sakrisha kingdom. As hot blood flowed from his mouth, he whispered with all his strength and said to Burin, "Lower, be, Burin." Kiri collapsed onto Burin's shoulder shortly after. Burin in a daze could only call Kiri's name. Kiri was still a little conscious and continued to whisper in Burin's ear, I did my best. But I must at least do this to repay you." Kiri's weak, intermittent voices seemed to cut into Burin's heart. The prince shouted in despair, "Kiri, it's okay." Oh. Kiri held Burin's hand in his last seconds. "Sir, raise your sword high, and please, don't stop." Kiri's head slid down from Burin's shoulder the next moment, and Burin was stunned into silence. Kiri's hand hit the ground, his body was no longer breathing, and the knights on the enemy side were still rushing towards Burin. For a moment, Burin seemed to turn into a stone statue. He sat there, his whole body frozen. The shock made Burin's breath choke. He lowered his head, both sad and indignant, muttering, "No, Kiri." Burin tightened his grip on his sword and an angry aura instantly spread out. Burin roared out the rage in his heart. The power of the scream and the strong aura emitted immediately repelled the enemy knights surrounding him. However, that is not enough to make Burin's enemies back down. They are stubborn and greedy. They are the army of Kairos, the nation created by humans and dragons. Kairos has demanded that Sakrisha hand over submit the treasure of their kingdom, the time axis. And when the Sakrisha refused that request, it was the beginning of the final war of the Sakrisha kingdom. Burin stood up defiantly and rushed towards the enemy knights. He began stabbing and slashing. Taking down scores of Kairos warriors, it seemed like nothing could stop him. Burin's eyes were filled with anger and murderous intent emanating from his entire body. He killed without stopping as if he wanted to announce to his enemies, the end of Sakrisha, never. While Burin was furiously killing countless enemy knights with beautiful, precise sword strikes, a magician suddenly attacked him from behind. Burin was startled to realize that the magician's attack was aimed at him. But he was unable to dodge it. His sword arm was cut off in the blink of an eye. Burin was in pain but absolutely did not make a sound. He clenched his teeth and swallowed back the scream that was about to come out. Right after that, Burin caught his sword with his other hand, his eyes determined not to give up. Burin stabbed the mage who had just attacked him in the chest and knocked him aside in revenge for his broken arm. On Burin's blood-stained face, murderous intent, rage and all the pain were clearly visible. At this moment only death could stop him. Kairos' army did not have just one mage. As soon as that mage was defeated, the other magicians shouted and started chanting spells. Only one remained, for the glory of Kairos. Huge magic circles opened up, and from their countless fireballs rained down on the battlefield like a meteor shower. Burin stood looking at the sea of fire surrounding him. Everywhere on the ground was burning. I knew it was too late. I could feel death approaching. During this time, Burin remembered Kiri's last words telling him not to stop, and his heart burned with determination. Burin proudly raised his sword as the enemy's giant fireball flew down right before his eyes. I can't let these things stop my footsteps. When the fireball was only about 2 meters away from Burin, the intense heat from it made his skin feel burned, but he still vigorously swung the sword with his non-dominant arm. Burin slashed a straight line towards the fireball. The sword aura was so powerful that it cut the fireball in half. Burin whispered in his heart, "I am the sword of Secretia." When Burin split the fireball in half with incredible power, Kyrus's magic army, Valkan, directly appeared to confront him. Burin turned to look at the army of hundreds of magicians leisurely surrounding him. With the strength of Burin alone, no matter how strong a swordsman he is, he cannot defeat all of them. Burin looked around at the enemies surrounding him, resentment rising in his heart, them, and the one who started this, the crazy king of Kyrus, Planche. They have turned my motherland into hell. The more Burin thought, the more the fire of indignation burned in his heart. At this moment, a mage in the Valkan army stepped forward. A long-haired man took off his hood and said to Burin in a respectful voice, "Nice to meet you, I am the commander of Valkan, Arson." Arson walked straight towards Burin. "You fought very stubbornly. What is your name?" Burin, in the rage that filled his mind, replied in an indifferent voice, "I forgot everything." He also took a step forward and stomped his foot on the ground, "I just." The sword only serves the king. Burin used the momentum to jump towards Arson with the sword raised to attack. In front of Burin's lightning attack, Arson was not afraid at all but instead smiled happily. Arson calmly raised his hand and ice spikes immediately appeared in the air. He looked at Burin with cold eyes. "I will remember you clearly, Prince of Secretia." Immediately afterwards, cold ice spikes pierced even Burin's armor, and the sword in his hand fell. Burin fell down. The last images remaining in his eyes were the enemy's mage army. Burin raised his hands trembling as the resentment filled his mind. After a fierce battle, our main character fell. The whole peaceful and proud life of a prince flashed through Burin's mind. He recalls his efforts to become a worthy successor in the kingdom, and also the fall of his beloved motherland. Burin's life ended here, when the light disappeared and before his eyes there was only cold blackness. Time seemed to stop at that moment, in silence for the Secretia kingdom and those who fought steadfastly. Fight to protect their motherland until their last breath. The scene suddenly changed to another place. The servant was busy pulling the curtains to open the sky filled with warm light. The tinkling bell rang out. A soft voice spoke up right after, "You have to get up." "There you go, Prince." The prince's butler, a young man, stood next to the prince's bed with a gentle smile. "Did you sleep well?" The prince always woke up startled every time he heard the door open, but today, people are still sleeping soundly. It wasn't until the second bell that the prince opened his eyes and then jumped up in a daze, startled by that sudden action. The general manager pointed outside with a worried expression, "You have to hurry up, Prince. Planche has gone ahead." The prince was startled as if he had just heard the devil's name. "What, Planche?" He clutched the blanket tightly in panic, a feeling of anger mixed with fear rising in his heart from his soul. In this prince's body is Burin. Burin was even more surprised when he looked at the unfamiliar arm. The wounds and calluses had disappeared, replaced by a white arm and slender fingers like a full moon girl. It wasn't even flawless. "Mark," Burin said, "my hand was cut off." The general manager shouted worriedly, "Why, Your Highness, why did you say such a terrible thing?" The maids standing in the prince's room were also frightened when they heard that his hand was cut off. Did he have a nightmare? Burin held his head and suddenly shouted, causing the general manager to panic even more, "Your Highness, are you okay?" Burin did not respond to the manager's words. What he just experienced was a nightmare. The fall of Secretia, it's scarier than a nightmare. Burin shuddered when thinking of that name, Planche, the name that belonged to the person he hated so much. Burin looked down at his arm with countless worries. His arm was still intact, and my servants had never seen it. What was going on? Where was this? Who was I? Burin had never seen these servants before, but a name suddenly popped into his mind as he looked at the foreman. "Yen, who am I?" Seeing Burin holding his face with a confused and seemingly distressed look, Yen awkwardly replied, "What?" Yen anxiously looked at Burin as if afraid he was losing his mind. "You are Kalian Ray Kyrus, and the third prince of Kyrus." And somehow miraculously, he awakened 10 years ago as the third prince of the enemy country. Burin trembled as if he had just experienced a terrible nightmare, even his voice trembled, "Kyrus." But what Burin had experienced was so real, it couldn't have been a dream, and he was also certain that his name was Burin, the Prince of Secretia. No matter how harsh the reality is, he will never escape into this paranoid world. The more Burin thinks, the more confused he becomes. What happened? Burin suddenly asked Yen urgently, "Hey, what day is today?" Yen was confused and pondered for a moment before saying, "What day is it? It's August 28th. After listening, Burin looked around. There seemed to be no war with Secretia right now. He asked again, "What year?" Yen looked confused and looked at him with worried eyes. "Year 522, Prince, what's the problem?" "What's that?" Burin's eyes were filled with tears of emotion. He bowed his head thoughtfully, thinking, it was impossible. Burin was lost in thought and sat still like a statue. It was now a decade before the final battle. The war broke out starting from the time axis. Time Axis, a unique and strange creature possessing the power to turn back time, suddenly appeared at the Royal Secretia Palace. No one knows why it appeared and where it came from. But no one cared to find out about it, only that news of its appearance quickly spread, and the one with the power to dominate the entire continent, Kairos, gradually became covetous of the Time Axis. Everyone in the Secretia Kingdom is upset. What does the Kairos mean by ordering them to take over the Time Axis? It's absurd. The Kairos are indeed powerful, but the Time Axis clearly belongs to us. We cannot at any cost hand over such a dangerous creature to an enemy country. Secretia rejected Kairos's proposal immediately, and then Kairos started war with Secretia like they had been waiting for this excuse for a long time. When the last royal army was forced into battle, Prince Burin became the commander of that army. The Emperor of Secretia and also Burin's brother, Chase, cried his eyes out to stop his brother from fighting. Sent to battle. Chase grabbed Burin's hand tightly and bowed his head as if begging him, everyone who went to the battlefield is dead. I can't lose you too. But Burin was still determined to go to war to protect his kingdom and his brother. After the regression, Burin remembered all that and speculated that day, Chase must have witnessed his brother's death with his own eyes, because the final battlefield was very close to the palace. Burin tried to think back before he died as if Chase's scream had echoed in his ears. No, Burin, if I could go back to the time before that horrible creature appeared. Thinking about this, Burin opened her eyes and suddenly thought of something. Wait a minute. He repeated under his breath as he remembered the magical power of the Time Axis. It couldn't be. Burin suddenly threw off the blanket and got up from the bed, making Yen startled and blurted out, Prince, where are you going? Burin leaned forward and stretched out his hand to open the window filled with sunlight. Could it be that he was using the Time Axis to go back in time? Burin wondered as he looked out at the flashy scene outside the Kalyan Palace, the place where the Kalyan prince lived. In a smaller part of the royal palace, however, the lake and the garden behind remained. Wide, sparkling lake surface, sunlight shining through the window. Burin pondered and never took his eyes off this scene. Maybe, he gave himself this last chance to stop. The end of Motherland, Secretia. Burin was suddenly attracted to stare at majestic stone dragon statue in the palace grounds, symbol of the Kairos Empire. The dragon's red eyes encrusted with rubies flashed, evoking a bold thought that appeared in Burin's head, as if to remind him to remember that his own identity was no longer Burin, but Kalyan Ray Kairos. As Burin was standing thoughtfully outside the balcony, Yen cautiously approached and reminded him, Your Highness, I understand that joining everyone for breakfast must be difficult for you, but we can't. No more delay. Burin tightened his grip on the balcony railing as if he had just made up his mind to do something important. If the Time Axis is the cause of everything, then it means there can be no going back, because time can only be reversed. Once in a while, Burin should definitely take advantage of his second life, he said in a low voice to Yen. Okay. Burin smiled friendly and began to play the role of Kalyan with the memories of the third prince that he had just received. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I'll go prepare right away. Burin smiled full of confidence and shine, completely different from Kalyan's normal personality. He told himself, if it is for the good of the homeland and to take full advantage of this opportunity, then I must definitely give birth. Survive well as the Prince of Kairos. After quickly preparing his clothes, Kalyan finally arrived at the prince's common dining room. As soon as the servant saw him, he immediately opened the door and loudly said, Kalyan, third prince, please come in. Meal. When Kalyan and Yen entered the dining room, there was already a prince sitting drinking tea. Yen awkwardly whispered to Kalyan, Please excuse me, Your Highness, I should have been a little quicker, I didn't expect that Prince Randall would be here first. Randall says Kairos is the first prince of Kairos, with luxurious golden hair and a delicate face, eyelashes even longer than those of a young girl. He is like a typical prince on white horse coming out of a storybook. Fairy tale. All three princes of Kairos are half-brothers, and are all descended from the Tensile Holy Kingdom. According to the Emperor's orders, breakfast will be prepared for all three children every morning. The nominal status of the three princes is equal, but according to the memories inside the Kalyan's mind, he is always treated as if he did not exist. Even though he knows that, the Kalyan still has to follow the rules. Tuber bowed to Randall and politely said, Please forgive me for my delay. As expected, Randall didn't even glance at Kalyan. A servant pulled out a chair. Kalyan immediately recognized it as his seat. He sat down with a forced smile, thinking to himself, I can't believe he ignored me so blatantly, it's hard. Really bear it. Kalyan placed his hand on the cup of tea he had just poured and looked thoughtfully out the dining room door. So, he is the only prince not yet here. At this moment, a man dragged his slippers on the floor and leisurely walked straight into the dining room. The servant standing at the door took a few seconds to recover when he saw his appearance, then quickly announced, "Planche, second prince, please dine." Colleen couldn't help but widen his eyes in shock when he saw the unimaginable image. Planche appeared in a strange appearance and calmly sat down on the chair without even saying a word to Randall. Colleen was so shocked that he almost exclaimed, "What the hell?" Planche's dressing style is so terrible that as a member of the royal family, Colleen can clearly see his bare skin underneath his loose jacket. However, this way of dressing is extremely eye-catching to the guests. Made in the palace, right? Colleen was still amazed and wondered, what member of the royal family would walk around like this? Even though Colleen was surprised by Planche's vulgar clothing, he did not forget to think about his long-standing enemy. Was he really the crazy King Planche that he knew about? Planche still didn't open his mouth to say a word. He calmly raised his face and signaled the maid to pour tea. Colleen quietly smirked with an ironic thought in his heart. Looking at the outfit, perhaps crazy has another meaning. Colleen cautiously glanced at Randall, who had also been silent. According to Colleen's memory, the first prince did not dare to be aggressive with the second prince. It doesn't matter if Randall is the eldest brother or the heir to the throne or not, but in front of Planche, he has no authority whatsoever. The reason is because the current queen of Kyrus is Planche's biological mother, Celise. With that fact, everyone in the room, whether satisfied with Planche or not, could only silently hide their thoughts in their hearts. No one in this palace can challenge the queen's authority, and no one is foolish enough to do so. Colleen suppressed the hatred burning in his heart. He raised his cup of tea and tilted his head back to drink it in one gulp, trying to hide his soft sigh, thinking about how frustrating it was to survive in a place like this. What a heart. When Colleen was swallowing his anger and reminding himself that this place was the royal palace of Kyrus, don't kill, be patient, at that moment Planche's eyes silently glanced towards he. A mocking laugh rang out and the sarcastic voice startled the Colleen. It was so rude. One was Planche's voice. No matter what he wore, his expression remained cold and unchanged and he didn't bother to look at Colleen properly. Planche continued to taunt Colleen, "You don't have any manners at all, after all you and your mother are still one person, right?" It was a bitter mockery of Colleen's mother, a very ordinary civilian. Feeling as if his own mother had been insulted, anger welled up in his heart. Colleen was so angry that he was shaking but still tried to stay calm and reminded himself that he had to be patient and couldn't let the opportunity that Chase gave him go to waste. But I still feel like something is rising up my throat, an uncomfortable burning feeling. Painful memories of Burns' past life flashed back into Colleen's mind at that moment. The more he thought, the more he boiled with hatred. Planche ruined Kyrus, the man who destroyed his homeland. He was sitting in front of him, leisurely and arrogant. I just want to slit his throat right away. The bastard has ruined my kingdom. Colleen's cold eyes suddenly shot straight towards Planche's throat. Planche immediately realized that Colleen's fiery red eyes of hatred were aimed at him. He glared in response. Planche inherently hated Colleen's eyes, so Colleen always had to let his hair fall down to cover his eyes. But now he dared to raise those red eyes and look at him as if challenging him. Right after that, Planche's teacup flew to the ground and shattered. The change in Colleen's attitude made the arrogant Planche furious. After the shattering sound of the cup, all the servants in the room held their breath due to tension. A heavy atmosphere enveloped everyone present. Planche angrily stood up, making everyone gasp. To worry, only Randall was still focused on his meal. He didn't even glance at them. What a perfect side guy. He widened his eyes and questioned Colleen in a harsh voice, "How dare you look at me like that?" Colleen raised his face and glanced at Planche again. Their eyes locked together, not taking a cup off until Randall put the teacup on the table and opened his mouth. "That's enough." The eyes of Colleen and Planche simultaneously turned towards Randall. Planche stared at Randall but Randall looked towards Colleen. Perhaps against Planche Randall was not capable, but with Colleen it was different, so he targeted an easier target. Planche also quickly realized that Randall did not dare to oppose him, so his eyes glanced at Colleen again. Colleen's cold eyes were now shooting at Randall instead of Planche. However, the red color of his pupils still made him feel uncomfortable. Planche appeared annoyed and smacked his lips before turning away. He didn't bother to ask Randall's permission but turned around and walked out, only throwing back a disrespectful sentence, "I'm leaving." Planche angrily walked out of the dining room and was still grumbling, no longer appetizing with those cursed bloody eyes. That was good because Colleen no longer had the patience to endure any longer. When Planche had just left, Randall suddenly stood up, startling Colleen. Randall said with an indifferent expression without even glancing at Colleen, "Colleen, review your behavior." Regardless of whether Colleen was right or wrong, Randall continued to act like a superior to lecture him. "His Majesty's birthday is coming up. Are you planning on causing trouble right before the holiday like that?" The reproachful words made Colleen surprised and speechless. If it weren't for the fact that he was still a little shocked when he woke up in a completely unfamiliar body, he definitely wouldn't have been able to endure this. Randall completely ignored his younger brother's murderous eyes. He stood up, left his seat, and left without paying attention to Kallian's reaction, while Kallian looked at the broken teacup on the floor for a moment. Annoyed, he means this is my fault. It was end because the bastard just stood up and left. Kallian leaned back in his chair and let out his anger in a sigh. The sigh of a small-throated person sounded so miserable. Yen worriedly looked at his tormented master and asked in a low voice, "Your Highness, are you okay? Are you injured anywhere?" Yen approached Kallian, pulled out a chair and knelt down to carefully clean his shoes. He couldn't help but complain, "It's true, you encounter these things every day, I'm sorry, the tea spilled all over." Shoes. The managers of the other two guys weren't that considerate to this extent. Seeing that, Kallian's anger gradually subsided. At least I still have a loyal servant who takes care of me more than himself. In Kallian's head, the subject's memories of this general manager were appearing. Kallian silently praised him. Even though he witnessed bad things happen to him every day, he still did not show indifference or contempt. Kallian suddenly placed his hand on Yen's shoulder, startling him. Kallian said to Yen in a quiet tone, "Yen, thank you for caring about me." Yen opened his eyes wide and looked up at Kallian. Yen was surprised to see a completely different Kallian prince. He tilted his head wonderingly to look at his charming smile. Normally, the Kallian prince would just silently cry, or at most be angry. A little, but now he's smiling again. After a not-so-delicious breakfast, Kallian freely walked around the artificial lake behind the palace. He stopped by the lake and looked up at the statue of a dragon spreading its wings. That statue was to commemorate the first queen of the kingdom. Kairos, dragon Sisphanian. He remembered a story that said she had hair as black as the still night and red eyes that burned with sacred dragon fire. Black hair, red eyes, Kallian clearly possessed the same external characteristics as her, but his strength was extremely pathetic. That is a prince who inherits the blood of the dragon but is weak and incompetent, and will be assassinated when he is less than 15 years old. Something that Burin, who had a habit of pulling his hair up, felt a bit uncomfortable when his current body's hair kept touching his eyes. But Burin was clearly sensing Kallian's subconscious fear when it came to Planche's hated eyes. Planche's words at breakfast appeared in Kallian's head again. His bloody eyes were cursed, a feeling of chill passed through him. Kallian wondered if his will had become weak because of the body. This youthful form, then he laughed at himself after that thought. Kallian pursed his lips and sighed as those memories flashed through his mind. I felt a bit embarrassed because it was like I was peeking at someone else's memories. After looking deeply into the subject's memories and fears, Kallian unconsciously clicked his tongue. Even though I had only heard of him, he was really an idiot. Just because he was afraid of a guy like Planche, he covered up away his eyes. Seeing Kallian mumbling to himself and then turning towards him, Yen immediately walked forward with an eager look. "What's wrong? Do you want me to do anything?" Kallian shook his head. "No, just go back first." Yen said to Kallian in a confused voice, "Your Highness, you're so strange today. Did you read a novel about knights last night?" Yen asked because Kallian's speaking style was so different from usual, but Kallian I just shook my head. "No, I don't care about that, not one bit." According to Burin's memories of his past life, the third prince of Kairos was born to a concubine of poor birth, not a Siphaenian dragon, and it was only by some coincidence that he possessed hair black and glowing red eyes like hers. That's why the former Kallian was always afraid of everything and had no one to back him up. He was so weak that he couldn't even protect himself. That is the situation that Burin in the current Kallian body must face and change. More importantly, Burin remembers that in his previous life, Kallian died right before his coming-of-age ceremony. Thinking of this, he stopped walking. Immediately, no matter how hard he tried to remember, Burin could not remember how old the current subject was. He wondered if Kallian would live until today without caring about his age. Finally, he decided to ask Yen, "Yen, how old am I?" It was a surprising question for Yen, causing him to hesitate for a moment in confusion. "In 4 months you will turn 15, Your Highness." Kallian heard that and immediately froze, his eyes showing horror. In his previous life, Kallian was 14 years old and was close to death. He was accused of plotting to poison Queen Celise but failed. Finally, Kallian hanged himself for fear of being punished. That was the published news, but no one believed that story. There were too many absurd points that happened right from the beginning of the story. If he was reincarnated in another person's body, then who was in his body, and why was he returned? Kallian didn't say a word and immediately ran away, causing Yen to panic and rush after him. "Your Highness, please slow down." In his previous life, Kallian died 2 or 3 months before turning 15 years old, and Yen said that his 15th birthday is now only 4 months away. Kallian rushed into the room and whispered, "There is only one left." 1 to 2 months before Kallian died, when I didn't know what was happening to my old body, I couldn't just sit still. Yen panted and looked at Kalian with worried eyes. If he fell, Kalian didn't pay attention to that but told Yen to pull him away. Yen looked at Kalian confused, "Why are you pulling?" Right after that, even though he was still wondering what Kalian was planning to do, he obediently followed his master's instructions and brought a pair of shiny silver scissors. Seeing Kalian excitedly holding the scissors up and waving them in front of him, Yen was both worried and curious and asked him, Your Highness, what do you need scissors for?" Kalian smiled mysteriously, looking at the scissors shining in the sunlight. He told Yen to change a few things. Right after that, in Yen's shocked eyes, Kalian did not hesitate to pull on his bangs. He thought to himself, if there was a predetermined future, then I will change it. Kalian bluntly cut off the loose hair that covered half of his handsome appearance. When Kalian's curls fell, all the servants widened their eyes in panic, and Yan's face was bloodless. He shouted loudly, "Your Highness, what are you doing? Prince Planche will be in trouble. I can bear it." Kalian shook his newly cut hair, a confident smile on his mouth. "I can't keep living like a fool forever just because he hates my eyes." It's no exaggeration when people say that Kalian looks a lot like his mother, Freya. Except for the color of her hair, she is praised as the reincarnation of a goddess. Kalian has confidence that has never been seen before, and he says with a bright smile with Yen, "It's okay, don't worry." Yen was surprised by his master's strange words and demeanor, but he couldn't feel secure about this sudden change, because he was worried that Planche would cause trouble. Kalian read the worry in Yan's eyes and smiled. "Reassure him, don't worry, I will handle it." That night, Kalian came to the dining room and sat in his seat. Soon Planche walked in with a confused look. When he saw Kalian, his small light blue eyes stared at his red eyes. He mumbled angrily, "You're crazy." Kalian didn't avoid Planche's eyes at all. He looked straight at Planche with his face no longer hidden behind a mop of ruffled hair and a smug smile, while Yen standing behind seemed dumbfounded. Yen whispered softly to Kalian while Planche was angrily walking towards the dining table, "Your Highness, this is what you said to handle it." The feeling of tension without gun smoke seemed to last for a century. Planche sat down as usual and said rudely, "Hey," his eyes were red. Kalian calmly took a sip of water after eating bread. He didn't even glance at Planche and just said indifferently, "Kalian." "My name is Kalian, Planche." Kalian raised his eyebrows and looked straight at Planche, a smug smile still on his lips. Planche smirked. For a moment, he closed his eyes slowly and wondered how he should react to what he had just heard. Then he looked down at the knife in his right arm, tapping his fingers on the handle. "Oh yeah, that's what I should call you." Clack, the steady tapping became louder. Planche frowned and stared at Kalian with a menacing expression. Planche growled angrily, "Using your name." Immediately after that he grabbed the small knife on the table and waved his hand high. The servants present in the room were shocked and frightened but did not dare to react openly. In the blink of an eye, Planche threw the knife in his hand towards Yen. He intended to vent his anger on Kalian's foreman. Yan's face turned white with panic. Kalian's face remained unchanged with his red eyes still staring at the Planche, but at the same time, his arm shot up very quickly. As quickly as it happened, Kalian put down the cup and reached out to catch the knife that was flying in front of Yen. Click, 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 drops of red blood fell from Kalian's bare hand holding the golden blade. Yen opened his eyes wide when he saw that scene. He screamed loudly, "Your Highness." Kalian tightly grasped the blade and still did not take his eyes off the Planche. Yen cried out in panic, "Electricity, Your Highness, your hand, you are seriously injured." Planche indifferently blurted out the fake words, "Oh my god, my hand slipped." He smiled sarcastically to provoke Kalian. Kalian's hand was injured, oh no. Kalian still clutched the knife in his hand and smiled mischievously in response to Planche. Kalian calmly stood up, picked up the bloody knife, gently placed it in front of Planche and calmly acted as if nothing had happened. "I'm fine, Mr. Planche." The meaning of this sentence was so strange that Planche couldn't help but be surprised and frown in concern. "Don't worry about my wound, I'm fine." Either I will forgive your rudeness, or both meanings. Kalian read the confusion in Planche's mind, so he tried to tease him even more. He raised his face slightly and said in a superficial voice, "It's okay." Kalian left his blood-stained knife in front of Planche and leisurely strode out of the dining room. Kalian returned to his room and Yen rushed to bandage him. Even though the bandage was finished, Yan's face still looked worried and uneasy. "Your Highness, I think we should call for treatment." Kalian immediately interrupted him, "No." Burin in his previous life was Sakricia's top swordsman. He didn't mind these small wounds, nor did he worry about leaving scars, so his voice now sounded indifferent, just small cuts. Kalian's words still couldn't make Yen stop worrying. He nervously looked up at Kalian, but Kalian once again stopped him. "Yen, why didn't you avoid it just now?" Kalian's unexpected question made Yen stunned for a moment. Kalian continued to ask while Yen was confused, "You know that shot was aimed at you. If I don't block it, what will you do?" Kalian remembered the look on Yan's face at that time as if he was resigned to accepting that knife. he was even more worried. You should have been able to avoid shots like that. Yen stammered for a while before finally speaking, but if I avoid it, he will use it as an excuse to cause more trouble with you, your highness. Kalian suddenly smiled with satisfaction at this loyal servant. He really appreciated those who were loyal to him, just like Kiri did before. After a faint smile, Kalian stood up and walked into the bathroom and didn't forget to tease Yen. Thanks to that, my hands are bleeding and my heart is beating so fast. I'll wash my face to calm down, so don't give it to anyone. When I heard that, I immediately felt guilty and more anxious. Wait a minute, your highness, I will help you. However, Kalian firmly replied, I can do it myself, and don't call the healer there. Yen outside feels depressed with anxiety. Your highness, why shouldn't I call the healer? Kalian quietly watched Yen with tears in his eyes tidy up the bandages on the table, to make sure he didn't secretly follow him into the bathroom. Kalian wasn't wary of Yen, but because he didn't want him to discover his secret and then get nervous again. Kalian thought back to what happened earlier. He had planned to use his aura to target Planche's attack. But at that moment, a throbbing feeling in his chest stopped him. Kalian wondered why his heart suddenly ached at that moment. Kalian put his hand on his chest and thought, I should recreate that situation. To confirm the Kalian's body condition, the Kalian begins to close his eyes and concentrate on using chi to check the subject's health. Burin in his previous life was a knight, one of only 6 sword masters on this continent. His body was extremely strong thanks to regular training, so he also knew how to regulate his breath to check health status. However, the results of this investigation stunned Kalian. He clenched his chest and muttered, what is this? Kalian realized that his body currently had 3 magic rings near his heart. At the same time, knowledge about the subject's strange and little magic began to flood into his head. Kalian was stunned and continued talking to himself, but it was as if he was speaking to the subject's soul. Kalian, you are. Are you a magician? Very quickly, 3 days later, Kalian's room was filled with Yan's moans. He checked Kalian's wound while complaining, causing Kalian to avoid those worried eyes. Yen said as if he was about to cry. It's been 3 days. And your wound is still the same. What should we do now? Kalian keeps getting upset because of the small wound, making Kalian only sigh. I said it's okay. Yen still refused to give up, sobbing and wanting to convince Kalian to call a healer. However, at that moment the royal tailor Seton Slake said to Kalian, Your Highness, it's ready. Kalian immediately looked. As if he didn't hear what Yen said, he stood up immediately. When Slake looked straight into Kalian's bright and radiant face, he was so surprised that he dropped the ruler in his hand. Nice to meet you, I am the royal tailor. His reaction made Kalian curious. What's wrong? Slake frantically bowed his head to Kalian. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but Freya. For some reason Yen shouted in annoyance, interrupting him. Slake. Slake continued to bow his head in confusion towards Kalian. Your Highness, I'm truly sorry. Kalian sighed and glanced at Yen, who was bowing even deeper than Slake. Ever since he cut his hair he had this reaction. Kalian, upon receiving reactions like this, rummaged through the subject's messy memories, and his heart sank when he learned that Kalian had previously suffered all kinds of hardships because he looked like Freya, the mother he never knew. He died shortly after giving birth to Kalian. That's why Kalian's face made the current queen extremely disgusted. He began to hate seeing his face, to the point that he destroyed every mirror in the room. Seeing that the tailor was so worried, Kalian immediately waved his hand and said to Slake, It's okay, I know I look like Freya, come here, do whatever you want. Slake was confused but could also breathe a sigh of relief. Let me take your measurements first. Only Yen is still angry and wants to jump into a fight with the tailor for touching on Kalian's painful matter. Slake carefully took Kalian's body measurements and sighed sincerely and gave Kalian advice. You must eat a lot, Your Highness, you are so small. Kalian raised his slender arm and said with a calm and confident expression, I eat well. Slake could only reluctantly nod and reply, I understand. Even though he reassured others like that, when Kalian stood in front of the mirror observing his body, he also felt depressed and thought, this is really worrying. Hakra, the founder king of Kairos and one of the 8 heroes who sealed the devil during the Battle of the Gods, married Sisphanian and made her queen. Sisphania was an ancient dragon and also one of the 8 heroes. The relationship between the two of them was balanced. Hakra didn't make Sisphanian his queen just because he wanted to, but it was because Sisphanian also chose Hakra as his companion. Sisphanian with love hoped that Hakra and his descendants would be special people, children carrying dragon blood, which was only passed down to biological children. They would have the ability to heal and use magical practice, also known as the Sisphanian blessing. In other words, the Kalian's wound should have healed a long time ago, but it hasn't healed at all. And every time he used mana, his heart ached. Faced with 2 unusual things, Kalian quietly placed his hand on his chest and grimaced slightly. Kalian silently lamented, this is trouble, at this rate I won't be able to use aura or magic. Ha, if an assassin comes I'll just have to die, while Kalian was lost in thought and slaked. Finished measuring and then turned around and nodded to Yen, I will bring the prepared clothes. Kalian didn't pay much attention to the outfit, he was just wondering, does anyone know about mana? Slake excitedly told Yen at that moment, I have prepared extremely suitable outfits for the party. His Majesty the Emperor's birthday. A thought suddenly flashed in Kalian's head, his eyes sparkled, that's right, the Emperor's birthday party. It was meant that Kalian was happy about the Emperor's birthday party, but he was remembering important events took place in previous lives at this exact time. Kalian was thinking about the story of a great magician, Elon Manisil. He thought to himself, he will come there, I must meet him. Elon is one of 3 mages with 7 magic circles today. He is the youngest, most talented, and most idolized 7-ringed magician of all the magicians. During the birthday event of King Kyrus in his previous life, Elon visited the capital to attend the king's birthday celebration. Although Kalian did not know the details, he learned that Elon came to the palace in shabby clothes. The guard at the palace gate saw this and stopped Elon, and stories of the negligence that caused him to be turned away from the door spread throughout the continent. And because he was refused, he then went to another kingdom. Elon Manisil, who was unable to attend the festival that year, became an 8-ringed mage 10 years later, the only person on the continent who could do so. Elon's magical knowledge is extremely rich and profound, so Kalian thought that, when it comes to understanding mana, no one can surpass him, he will be able to help him in the matter of fundamentals. This body. While thinking, Kalian looked a little bored and glanced out the window. I don't know what mistake or negligence that year was, but Kyrus doesn't always treat magicians kindly, so I don't know if he has any sympathy. Do you agree with my suggestion? When Kalian looked through the window, he saw the Brisson Knights and suddenly thought, the reason why tens of thousands of knights refused to join the Kyrus kingdom was because of the influence of Planche's maternal family, the Brisson family. He thought to himself, even if it's just to control Brisson's power, I still need the power of the magicians. If I can bring Elon to my side, then I can stop the Planche war that is about to start crest in the future. Kalian had determined his next move and stood up, looking towards the group of servants who were buzzing about his costume being designed. Kalian smacked his lips and sighed, before that, I have to deal with this. This already. Kalian was almost petrified when he saw the outfit that Slake and Yen were so excitedly designing for him. Aren't these ribbons too small? I like big ribbons like this template. Should I add lace? Is a strong swordsman and doesn't like fancy flashy things. Kalian gave orders bluntly, no ribbons, no loose lace. Both Slake and Yen exclaimed in surprise, with disappointment. What's up? Kalian continued to nag, do you think I'll be okay if I wear that lace? What's with those beads? What are you trying to do? The Kalian then spent a busy week waking up to the scent of tea, preparing and enjoying breakfast, and participating in other mandatory princely activities. It was a beautiful morning again and Kalian drank his morning tea quickly. He sighed and thought, at least I'm getting used to this life. Kalian looked down at his hand that had completely healed without a scar. He thought about the recent breakfasts since that fierce conflict. Planche still glared at Kalian every time he saw him, but the number of times Planche frowned had decreased. Went significantly, that attitude made Kalian extremely satisfied. Planche finally ignored him, so it was even more beneficial. Yen came next to Kalian, took the cup of tea and announced the day's schedule. In the morning you have a horse riding lesson, and in the afternoon, you have a dinner appointment with the Queen and Viscount Brisson. Kalian tilted his head and asked. Yen immediately replied, yes, I think it's probably because of your Majesty's birthday party. Kalian pondered while getting up from the bed. Viscount Brisson is the second son of the Brisson family and the Queen's older brother. Although he was born into a family of knights, he was extremely poor in swordsmanship and gave up his weapons early on, instead owning one of the largest merchant guilds in Kyrus. Kalian sighed again, seemingly bored when thinking about the Viscount. Well, eventually I will have to meet him, a guy who is not even capable of managing a merchant guild, so he has to spend a lot to thanks to someone else to manage it, but thanks to possessing countless assets, he can still do something. As Kalian changed clothes, Yen glanced at him and hesitantly asked with concern, Your Highness, you also plan to practice today? Kalian shrugged his shoulders and replied with a look full of energy, saying that he was exercising was a bit of an exaggeration, it was just running around the lake next to the palace. Yen was talking about the physical training that Kalian proposed for him during the past week. It wasn't too strict, but it made Kalian lose weight, which made Yen worried. Before going out to practice, Kalian smiled brightly and reassured him. And Yen, don't worry too much, anything's okay. Kalian diligently trained his body in the hope of improving this weak body, but after only running a few laps he was panting, his breathing so loud that it could be heard clearly from a few meters away. Kalian's steps became slower and slower and his legs seemed to be losing strength and just wanted to collapse. After 3 rounds, Kalian finally had to stop due to exhaustion. Sweat ran down his forehead and he felt his lips burning, his throat was dry and he couldn't stop gasping for breath. Colleen clung to a tree by the lake and hugged his chest. I was going to die. At this moment Marilyn Flat, Callion's servant, the second daughter of the commander of the Capital Knight Regiment on defense duty in the suburbs, caught up with him with a worried look on his face. Your Highness. Marilyn looked at Callion's haggard face and looked confused. Are you okay? The first day was 4.5 laps, the third day was 4 laps, and today. Marilyn hesitated for a moment then continued, you only ran 3 laps. Colleen just remained silent because what she said was right. He thought to himself, yes, I'm exercising to increase my physical strength, but my health keeps decreasing, what's wrong? Marilyn worriedly suggested, if you're too tired, can we call a doctor? Colleen tried to take a slow breath to regain his strength and shook his head, no, it's okay. Colleen clutched his chest as if he wanted his rapidly beating heart to stabilize. He thought to himself, if he called a doctor, his mana vein would be exposed immediately. Out of all the stupid and repressive actions that the Colleen had done before, the only thing he did well was hide the fact that he was a magician. Even Yen didn't know this secret. If everyone knew he could use magic, he would probably be killed before Burn even entered his body. They would try to eliminate him before he got too strong. For that reason, currently, Colleen still hides the magic circle. Furthermore, his magic does not work normally. If he is careless, he will fall into the noose even sooner than Colleen in his previous life. After her breathing stabilized again, Colleen pretended to be fine and told Marilyn, it's okay, my health is just weakening, why call a doctor? Although Marilyn was still worried, she didn't know what to do. Convince Colleen. Callion's whole body was still shaking from fatigue but he still forced a smile to reassure her, I said it's okay, just wait a while to get better. At that moment a scream rang out, interrupting their conversation, don't worry. Turn away. The scream was so loud and powerful that both Colleen and Marilyn curiously turned their eyes towards the source of the sound, read the direction of the sword slash, and became alert. Marilyn exclaimed and said to Colleen, it seems the knights have started training. At the training ground right now, General Pable is disciplining his soldiers, don't avoid the sword like that, hey, you, if this were a battlefield you would have died 100 times over. With the spirit of a swordsman flowing through him, Colleen immediately walked closer to watch the warriors practice. Pable was still focusing on training without paying attention to them. Don't hesitate, keep going. Colleen suddenly smiled and thought, I miss the old days so much, it was great. However, Marilyn following behind him seemed worried and softly said, Your Highness, this is the training grounds of the Pable Knights. Colleen smiled brightly and told her, yes, I know, I came to see it because it was interesting. Callion's answer made Marilyn scream in shock, sir, you had no interest in swordsmanship before. After that, Pable noticed their appearance. Colleen continued to chat with Marilyn, now I think it's okay to enjoy sword training. Marilyn was still worried and asked Colleen, Your Highness, do you know the group? What kind of place is Pable Knight? Colleen calmly replied, yes, of course, they were the royal knights, well, to be precise, they were the Breeson family's knights, which kept the king's power in check. While the two of them were talking, Pable boldly walked up from behind Colleen and asked, Who are you? Of course it's impossible that he doesn't know the third prince, he just looked down on him so he asked that. Pable didn't wait to hear the answer but used his cold eyes to chase them away, if there was nothing to do then go away. Colleen could immediately see that his attitude was filled with contempt for a weak and helpless prince. Pable continued to show his authority as a general in front of Colleen. The knights were distracted by your gaze. And unable to practice seriously, the warriors below at the training ground simultaneously turned their disdainful eyes towards Colleen. Marilyn couldn't bear to see Colleen being insulted and shouted, Please show some respect, this is the third prince Colleen. Pable still didn't change his attitude but became even more arrogant. He gritted his teeth and said in a disdainful voice, Ah, is that so, so you are the Colleen prince? Pable smirked and continued, I still think. Are you some mouse sneaking around? Pable narrowed his eyes while laughing and mocking Colleen. His attitude made Callion's face stiffen, of course not because he was scared, he was just thinking about how to handle him nicely. In his heart, Colleen was both annoyed and ridiculous at the childish actions of someone who had become a general. Oh my god, look at him. Marilyn angrily criticized Pable again, in front of his highness, how dare you say those blasphemous words? Pable replied indifferently, I told him I misunderstood him. Pable proudly glanced at Colleen, why did she have to be so sensitive? The prince didn't even care. However, the next second, Pable fell silent and his eyes widened in horror. The thing that made a warring general like him panic was Callion's eyes full of murderous intent, the look of a ruthless killer who had taken thousands of lives just for him. Pable couldn't help but be shocked and looking into those eyes, what is this? If it was the other day, he was sure. Pable remembered that not long ago, he had encountered Colleen and stood proudly on his horse and shouted, What are you doing, third prince? I have to return to receive the queen's summons. how dare you block my way. Kalyan was then scared and crouched against the wall and mumbled, please excuse me, I will get out of the way right now. After that incident, Pabel was sure that Kalyan was just a weak prince, but Kalyan's current temperament is completely different. Pabel couldn't help but be stunned by that cold-blooded murderer's expression. Why did he look like a completely different person now? Kalyan suddenly spoke, his sharp voice startled Pabel. General Pabel, let me ask you something. He glared as if he wanted to devour Pabel, his cold voice continued to ring out, what is your mission? Pabel was clearly frightened by Kalyan's aura. At this moment, several knights under his command stepped up and asked, General, what's going on? Pabel was startled again. Of course he couldn't let himself be said to be scared by the soldiers. In front of someone as weak as the third prince. When Pabel had not yet regained his arrogant demeanor, the two soldiers behind him whispered in contempt of Kalyan, isn't that the third prince? What is he doing here? Really annoying. Thanks to those whispers reaching Pabel's ears, he was motivated. That's right, he was just the third prince, a prince that even the knights looked down on, so Pabel returned. Smiling arrogantly, he said to Kalyan, you see, I'm in the middle of training so I can't answer you. I hope the prince will continue with his work. Marilyn felt worried and looked at Kalyan, His Highness, but Kalyan's face remained unchanged, his voice was harsh, General Pabel. Each sound coming from Kalyan's throat seemed to have 1,000 pounds of pressure weighing down on the atmosphere there. I'm asking you. Report your mission quickly. As soon as the two knights stepped up, they felt the Kalyan's unusually strong aura. Pabel in front of the soldiers became even more hesitant about how to behave, continue to act arrogantly or bow to the Kalyan. He finally decided to answer the matter. My mission is to build a strong royal army and protect the royal family and this kingdom. When Pabel thought that was the end of the matter, Kalyan suddenly picked a sturdy tree branch and broke it down. That's right, to build and protect. But you did not fulfill both of those duties. Kalyan coldly grasped the tree branch in his hand like a weapon. Kalyan's fierce attitude and brave temperament made the warriors gasp in surprise. No one imagined that the weak third prince dared to accuse General Pabel in front of his army. Pabel gritted his teeth, veins showing on his face in anger. What are you talking about? Kalyan calmly walked straight towards Pabel in a ready attack position, first building a strong royal army. According to what we observed, to be honest, his army training was completely a task. Mess. As soon as he finished speaking, Kalyan's red eyes flashed with murderous intent. Right after that, before Pabel could regain his composure from Kalyan's sudden change, he suddenly disappeared in the blink of an eye. The Kalyan was using the experiences of the swordsman in his previous life, moving suddenly and attacking quickly from behind Pabel. The moment Pabel discovered the Kalyan jumping from behind, he immediately turned his head, based on the Kalyan's arm swing, and judged if he couldn't block that attack. We will lose our lives. Pabel was so panicked that he forgot that in Kalyan's hand was just a tree branch. He immediately pulled out his sword despite the fact that the person confronting him was a member of the royal family. At the moment when Kalyan's stinging branch flashed close to Pabel's neck, he promptly raised his sword to block it. He didn't know if it was because the branch Kalyan chose was too hard or if Pabel's sword blade was dull. Cutting the branch didn't break. Kalyan could even compete back and forth with Pabel for a few seconds with just that slender branch, leaving Pabel in shock and horror. Kalyan put strength into his hand to push the branch forward, working so hard that his hand had red veins all over it. When he felt that the thrust between the two sides was tight enough, Kalyan smiled cunningly and suddenly let go of his hand, letting the tree branch fall. Pabel, who was concentrating on pushing the sword out, couldn't react in time to Kalyan's small action. As a result, his thrust created momentum that caused both the blade and the branch to fly away. Kalyan deliberately rubbed his wrist in front of everyone and smiled provocatively at Pabel. I can't believe you can't guess the moves of someone like me who has never held a sword. You disappoint me. Pabel also put a lot of effort into the fight just now, making his hands shake. What the hell is this? The way he acts, that damn aura. Kalyan smacked his lips and continued to criticize Pabel. As for the second thing, the protector of the royal family and the kingdom dared to be so disrespectful to a member of the royal family, and even dared to use a sword to hurt the prince. Kalyan scowled and glanced at Pabel warningly. Should we consider that treason? Pabel was scared and sweated like crazy. He was terrified and wondered if he was really the third prince I knew. No matter how powerful Pabel was, the crime of treason was no joke. He quickly knelt down and bowed his head before Kalyan, asking for forgiveness. Prince Kalyan, because I was stupid. Pabel continued to beg Kalyan in the shocked eyes of the knights. I had no thoughts of treason. Pabel bowed his head to the ground and tried to express his regret by shouting, please forgive me, please have mercy. However, even with my head planted on the ground and my ass up in the air like that, Pabel still did not truly obey Kalyan. He silently cursed in his heart, because of this damn useless third prince, I was punished. Such humiliation. While waiting for Kalyan's leniency, he viciously told himself, I will never forget today's humiliation. Not long after that, Colleen and Marilyn returned with a surprise that made Yen frown and worry. Why, the speaker came here to exercise. But he brought back a horse. Yen shouted in shock when he saw Colleen smiling brightly leading a horse. It was a black horse with a white front leg, mane and tail carefully groomed, muscular, toned and sleek body. From the moment he saw it, Colleen knew it was great. Colleen threw the reins back to Yen and calmly said, I picked him up on the way here, his name is Raven. As soon as Yen grabbed the reins, the horse showed resistance, making him struggle. Yen shouted. Colleen asked, wait, where did you go, why did you bring this horse back? The story is that just now, after the commotion subsided at the training ground, this horse happened to catch Colleen's eye. He asked the riders, what was that horse? The knights miserably tried to hold the reins to hold the horse back, but it kept bucking stubbornly. One knight told Colleen, Prince Planche can't tame it. He said, who can tame it? If you can conquer it, you can own it. The knight sighed and continued talking to the Colleen, but you see, it was very aggressive. The horse showed determination not to lose to the Planche. The Colleen immediately smiled with delight when he saw such a creature, this horse. After personally taming it easily based on his experience as a knight in his previous life, Colleen calmly brought it back. As soon as Yen heard the story, he immediately shouted in worry, he just brought his horse back. Prince Planche is back. Colleen replied very calmly. He said that whether he was the guide or the horse keeper, anyone who wanted to try riding it was welcome. While Yen was having a hard time with the horse, Colleen turned to whisper to Marilyn, please hold on. Keep quiet at the training school. Marilyn immediately nodded. Yen still can't feel secure. Wait, but what if he finds out? Colleen exhaled an exasperated breath and replied, I told you it's okay, if anything happens. At this moment, Colleen's heart suddenly ached, causing him to scream out loud and clutch his chest. Both Marilyn and Yen saw this and ran back in panic. Colleen gritted his teeth and endured the pain. Just as I thought, I overworked my body. Yen impatiently asked Colleen, wouldn't today's physical training be a bit too much for you? Colleen shook his head to reassure him, it's not like that, it's been a long time since I've been able to freely play with someone. So different. Yen was startled and said, who are you playing with? Colleen was almost exposed and quickly tried to avoid it. Yen, if this happens we won't be home in time for dinner today, hurry up and prepare. Yen panicked as soon as he was reminded, yes, I will quickly prepare your highness, what to do with this horse now. While the three of them were talking, behind the palace wall, a shadow of a person was watching and then quickly left. The stalker then returned to report everything to his master, a man who also lived in the palace, owning a beautiful campus full of blooming rainieri flowers. The stalker's master asked him, I understand. Okay, so what does it say? After listening to the report, a sinister smile appeared on that person's lips. It's really interesting. I heard that even worms can squirm. It's really fitting. But unfortunately, even if a person like him writhes, he can't change his fate. That person's slender hands crushed the newly sprouted flower bud as if it were a Colleen. That person dropped the broken flower bud and told the servant that just strangling it would not be fun at all, so let's use this method. When the tiny flower petals fall to pieces, a savage laugh rings out, now let's see how you will writhe. That night, Colleen sat in the dining room waiting with a bored look. He couldn't help but slightly raised his lips and sighed, ha. It was still the usual silence between princes, but Colleen felt a bit depressed. This atmosphere was truly unaccustomed. Did it have to be like this every day? Colleen stared at Planche. Instead of his usual rebellious look, today he was a little different. Colleen wondered why that bastard was so quiet today. When Planche glanced sideways at Colleen and then looked away immediately, Colleen silently lamented, it must be my fault that the Queen and Viscount Brisson were late. He really couldn't control his expressions, he's still so childish. Suddenly, a passionate fragrance filled the space, the scent of rainieri flowers made all eyes turn to the woman entering the dining room. And looked at the woman dressed in green from head to toe and thought to herself, she is finally here, the one who holds the true power of this kingdom. Celise Brisson, second queen, current queen of Kairos. After the previous queen passed away from illness, Celise took that position thanks to the family's power. She didn't stop there, she borrowed power from her family, Brisson, and took control of the royal knight army. Most of the nobles support the Brisson family, so Celise's power increases day by day. And the powerless prince, Colleen, whom Celise hated because of his resemblance to Freya, became a laughingstock among the common people. Following Celise into the dining room was Viscount Renan Brisson, the second son of the Marquis Brisson. He chuckled and asked Celise, so shall we make an agreement with General Pabel? Celise replied coldly, yes. Give him full compensation. Renan seemed like a puppy running after Celise, yes, I understand, and Celise spoke to him in a cold voice, and in the future don't report to me small things like this anymore. After sitting down, Celise raised her face and smirked and her eyes slightly turned towards Colleen as if she wanted to tell him, seriously, do I even have to pay attention to trivial things like this? Colleen stared at her, of course understanding what she meant to look down on him. The atmosphere in the dining room became even more tense after Celise appeared. Except for Planche, who still appeared indifferent and sat sloppily, the rest of the people maintained the demeanor of royalty. With a bang, Celise's blue silk fan opened, her sarcastic voice then broke the silence in the room. Colleen. You've grown up a lot lately, Celise asked with a fake smile. Colleen immediately paid attention to that question, clearly she didn't mean his height. There was a long, empty silence before Colleen responded. He silently smirked at her question. I had expected this reaction. Colleen relaxedly raised his glass of wine and replied, well, I haven't grown up much yet. But I'm sure you'll grow up even more in the future. Colleen raised his glass and flashed a very comfortable and confident smile. Both Randall and Planche were startled and stared at Colleen because his bold behavior in front of the queen was different from before, even though Colleen had changed significantly recently, but facing the queen that's another matter, no one thought he had the courage to do that. Celise was stunned, that was not the face of a 14-year-old boy. Colleen had never dared to laugh like that, and that laugh made her feel uncomfortable inside. Renan, of course, did not know the truth behind the confusing exchanges between the two of them but was very excited to continue talking, of course, but whether you have grown much or not, I almost didn't recognize you. The more Renan talked, the more excited he became. Now you're showing your face, I'm so happy to see your face, you should have cut your hair sooner, there are many skills necessary to survive in the upper class. The ability to judge the situation, it may not need to be very good but at least you have to grasp the basics. Renan clearly lacks both. Renan continued to chatter without knowing how to read other people's moods, and since you're still in the development stage, you will definitely. Celise couldn't stand it anymore so she put the fan next to the table and shouted, brother. Celise glared at Renan angrily. It was a blatant look that told him to shut his mouth. It's unclear whether Renan understood Celise's hidden meaning or because he was afraid of her fiery eyes and became angry. Embarrassed, I'm so hungry, hurry up and bring the food. Colleen had to try hard not to laugh. The owner of Breeson Merchant Guild is this stupid. He tried to hide his smile with a glass of wine and thought to himself, everything is just like the rumors, so interesting. Celise turned her eyes towards the unusually silent boy. After all, she had nothing more to say to Colleen. Planche saw Celise glance at him, he immediately glanced back with a disapproving look. Celise spread her fan again and asked Planche, why don't you tell me? Planche replied indifferently, about what? Celise asked Planche a meaningful question about her horse not listening. Planche glanced at Colleen, a bit wondering if he was talking about that raven horse, or about Colleen. Colleen didn't care at all and ignored Planche's look. Planche shook her head and turned away, then sighed and thought, she's probably not the type of person who cares whether the horse is ferocious or not. Celise saw Planche's superficial attitude and continued, it would have been nice if you had told me first. Planche completely understood what his mother meant. Colleen should have lived quietly and died quietly, just like his mother. He disappeared like a speck of dust before he could become a thorn in Celise's side, but Planche didn't bother to report to Celise because his servant was nothing more than a spy for his mother. Planche was indifferent. Replied, you already knew. Before Planche's reaction, Celise said with a disappointed voice, you never told me that it was out of your hands. Planche stopped and didn't eat anymore. He angrily dropped his fork and said in a disdainful voice, from the beginning it was a useless horse. Planche behaved like a rebellious teenager, viciously stood up and said to Celise, I'll go first. Celise was surprised by Planche's cold attitude and behavior. She was shocked because her son seemed to be gradually slipping out of her control. 3 weeks later, the emperor's annual birthday party finally arrived. Not only the royal palace but the entire capital Kairesis was bustling in preparation for the king's birthday celebration. Some people were welcoming guests, others were preparing the banquet table, and the rest were the guards ensuring security for this party. All of them couldn't help but look excited before the big festival. One by one, nobles gathered at the Kairos, ambassadors from faraway lands also gathered here. A few days ago, the crowd was still buzzing trying to catch a glimpse of the goblins entering the city bring tons of gifts. The people were all in awe as they looked at the group of people flocking into the city. Oh, look, that's a congratulatory delegation from the elves, those are all gifts, right? The birthday party must be very lavish. The princes are probably busy preparing for this important day, even Colleen is no exception. Callion's body size is being remeasured to ensure that the outfit attending the king's birthday party will not have errors. However, right after measuring the circumference of Callion's body, the tailor who had been preparing his clothes for a month had to grimace with tension. Wait, what? Slake tearfully looked up at Colleen as his measurements decreased again. Your Highness, you ate. At this moment a drop of blood fell to the floor right in front of him. Slake's face immediately turned pale, he was stunned into silence for a few seconds before he could scream. Kallian's face was now full of blood, his nose bleeding abnormally, causing Slake to scream loudly in anxiety, "Highness." As soon as Yen saw that, he immediately ran over, he also shouted after Slake, "Your Highness, Your Highness." Yen eagerly told the servant to quickly bring bandages here, but Kallian simply covered his nose and reassured them, "It's okay, it's nothing." Kallian tried to explain, "It's because I haven't been sleeping well lately, see, there's no more bleeding." Yen was so worried that he shouted, "That's not the problem." Slake then spoke up cautiously, apologizing for my rudeness, "But that's not all, Your Highness." Slake sadly said in a sympathetic tone for Kallian, "He has lost a lot of weight." Slake choked up and said to Kallian, "3 weeks ago you still looked like you had skin and flesh, but now?" Kallian smiled and tried to reassure the fragile-minded tailor, "Have I become so skinny, or is it because I've been exercising too hard lately?" In fact, Kallian himself clearly understood that his body was actually getting weaker and weaker. Kallian thought to himself, I've been training very hard, but my endurance is getting worse and worse. The pain every time I use mana is still there, there's definitely something wrong with my heart." Kallian quietly glanced down at his chest. He couldn't help but feel restless and worried. Of course he didn't want to lose his life early, so he tried to improve his health, but everything seemed unsolvable if he didn't find out. Understand the cause of heart pain. Slake was genuinely worried about Kallian, so he tried to advise him, "You must not take this lightly, Your Highness. Have you been examined by a doctor?" Kallian just laughed and replied, "It's not that bad, it's just a nosebleed." "Well, we still have to go see a doctor." Kallian silently lamented, "This grandfather keeps reminding the therapist, why do I have a nosebleed in front of so many people?" Slake continued to plead, "It's not just a nosebleed," but Kallian just tried to laugh it off, "I'm really okay, haha." Just when Kallian thought he couldn't let this go, Yen suddenly spoke up, "I knew it right away. It was because you picked your nose yesterday." Yen's words stunned everyone, even Kallian also couldn't believe his ears. Yen stated firmly, "Even though this is a delicate matter, it is difficult for you to admit that personal preference to others." Kallian looked at Yen bewilderedly, slowly, something. Meanwhile, the servant and Slake all believed what Yen said, "Well, so Prince Kallian has such a secret hobby." Yen calmly said to Slake, "I told you, Prince Kallian eats and exercises very moderately, the nosebleed is probably due to his hobby, don't worry too much." Slake heard that, so he let go of the matter. "Call the healer." "Well, if Yen said so then it's okay, because he knows the prince best." Kallian felt like he was dead for a moment. Where was the super cool handsome image he had worked so hard to build since his regression until now? But Yen smiled and was very proud of his work. Yen even winked at Kallian as if he wanted him to take credit for just rescuing him. Kallian just looked at Yen with shocked eyes, this brat. A few days before, Kallian also had a nosebleed and Yen was extremely worried, "Are you okay? You don't look well." The more weak his body became, the more Kallian felt like he was about to lose consciousness, so he had to tell her about this in case anything happened, and after Kallian explained that he could use magic, and the reason he was weak lay in mana, then Yen understood Kallian's mood. Kallian realized that now Yen was trying to help him but still couldn't help but complain, "He was planning to ruin my image like this, nonchalantly. After all, luckily with him, I wouldn't be questioned anymore, that's it." After the nosebleed subsided, Slake continued his work, "So I fixed my clothes right away." Slake still had something to worry about telling Yen, but time was a bit tight, so Yen immediately replied, "It's okay, the prince also has things to do, so until the event happens, he still has plenty of time." Slake happily ran away holding a few bundles of cloth. "Oh, that's lucky, in that case I'll fix the outfit for the afternoon's event first," while Yen leaned into Kallian's ear and whispered, "Your Highness." "Not today," Yen asked Kallian softly, and it seemed like the two of them had something planned. Kallian just silently nodded to Yen. He thought to himself, "At this rate, my health condition will be spread to the whole palace soon, so before then. Tonight, I must meet Elon Manasil at all costs." Then, when Kallian finished preparing for the luncheon and went to the dining room, the king's assistant suddenly told him that because the emperor had urgent matters to attend to, the luncheon could not be held as it was expected. "So we will instead meet each person individually." Hearing the old assistant say that, Kallian was stunned for a moment. Kallian widened his eyes in confusion. "We didn't even have time to meet each other, but he wanted to meet each person separately. Wouldn't it be more convenient to meet everyone at the same time?" Whatever the reason, he still had to follow the king's instructions, no matter how things changed. Then Kallian and Yen quickly followed the assistant to the king's office. This was the first time Burin met Kallian's father. He never thought he would have to meet him in private in such a sudden way. Burin could not find any memory of the subject about the private meeting between father and son. He could only sigh in his heart. He didn't expect to have to meet privately. He was a little worried. When arriving at the king's office, the assistant respectfully leaned over to open the door for Kalian. "Please invite the prince in, your majesty is already waiting." Kalian entered the room with a solemn expression. He was like a crane swimming on the surface of a lake. Even though he appeared so calm, deep inside, he felt extremely suffocated. In his previous life, Burin had never met the king. His father has been treated several times for his incompatibility, so now he is even more awkward. Even when Kalian entered the room, his father still stared at the stack of documents without even looking up or smiling to greet his son. King Romain also has black hair. At first glance he also looks a bit like a king in a fairy tale. He seems to be a careful thinker, with dark blue eyes and an unpredictable attitude. The heavy pressure radiated without a word. Everything in Romain could be seen in Randall. Kalian respectfully approached Romain and bowed to him, asking to see his majesty. Kalian waited for the king to say hello back, or just a yes. According to the rules, when Romain didn't give permission, Kalian couldn't look up at him, but he stood there, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, after almost a minute, Romain still didn't react. Kalian directly raised his head and the scene before him made him truly confused. Romain didn't seem to pay any attention to Kalian, as if those papers were more important than his son. Kalian thought to himself, does he ignore me? Kalian began to feel that his speculations about Romain being a cold and heartless king were correct, but he just kept that resentment to himself, even though he knew nothing about Kyrus's rituals. But surely this behavior was very rude. Kalian's eyes suddenly hardened until Romain spoke up and sat down. Even though he wasn't happy at all, Kalian still sucked on the soapberry, smiled and sat down opposite Romain, wishing him a happy 38th birthday. Romain replied nonchalantly, without even raising his head, "Yes, how are you?" Romain said calmly without even glancing at Kalian. "You look so cheerful these days." Kalian was completely frozen at that caring, loving question. He remembered how in the morning, Slake was so worried when he saw his haggard appearance. "Your Highness, have you been examined yet?" "I'm very worried about you." Kalian continued to laugh, but this time it was a bitter smile that even passers-by recognized. In that moment, he realized how quickly the Kalian had been dealt with in his previous life, because even his father didn't even care about his life or death. Kalian couldn't help the bitterness welling up in his heart. Even though this wasn't his father, now I know the reason why he wanted to meet everyone individually even though he didn't have time. Kalian glanced at the documents on the table with a feeling of sadness. If he met all 3 princes at the same time, he would have to focus on chatting, so meeting them individually was more effective. Kalian looked at the king who was burying his head in official matters, not knowing whether to be happy or sad. He probably thought spending time listening to his son wish him a happy birthday was a waste. The first meeting of Kalian and Romain ended quickly afterwards, and from that moment until the afternoon, when the emperor's birthday party took place, Kalian could not stop his disgruntled thoughts. The more I know about this family, the more I see that this is a mess, a father who doesn't care about his children at all. The great prince is a man who doesn't care about life. The second prince is a rude person and never smells of alcohol. When the party had started, Celise proudly walked forward. Romain immediately said in a reproachful tone, "You're a bit late." Celise calmly replied with an arrogant voice, "Yes, it's unavoidable." Seeing Celise's face, Kalian became even more fed up with the royal family of this kingdom, a queen with enough power to show contempt for the king. Kalian's eyes are now full of contempt and hate. Among them there is someone trying to destroy him. Let's see who it is. Kalian rolled his eyes again looking at his family members and wondered, who sent the assassin to assassinate him? Before the banquet in the palace begins, members of the royal family will go out to meet the people. The square is so packed that there is no longer any room to walk. The people look up and admire and praise Kalian. That became a hot topic of discussion among the nobles attending the royal party. The nobles whispered amongst themselves, "Have you heard anything, just recently, in the square, Prince Kalian?" "Yes, I heard the rumor too. He appeared in front of the people with a completely different appearance." "Right, compared to him, the second prince of clans looks like he's drunk." Before Kalian appeared at the party, all the nobles were talking and some were skeptical. "I guess it won't change anything, the free people always make a big deal out of it." But there are also people who believe in that. Really, doesn't everyone see that, unlike before, something has changed? Finally, it was time for the nobles' curiosity to be answered. The voice of the media rang out. The third Prince Kalian Ray Kyrus arrived. All eyes immediately turned to him. Kalian confidently strode into the banquet hall, where the nobles gathered. When Kalian entered the banquet hall, the whole world seemed to be turned upside down. The nobles there began to examine every little detail of his appearance, under wide eyes of surprise. They could not imagine it's true that Kalian changed. Many people whispered to each other, "Oh my god, the rumors are true." His handsome face and bright red eyes attracted everyone's attention here. The constant chatter followed every majestic step of Kalian, the prince with black hair and red eyes like Sisfanian. Her bangs that fell over her face. With a regal smile on his lips and aristocratic steps, everyone stood there dumbfounded admiring Kalian. It was truly the regal charisma of a member of the royal family. Not only his figure, but also the outfit that Kalian was wearing also attracted countless looks from the nobles. Kalian's outfit was simple, with no decorations other than the pin on his shirt, but though the nobles all looked at the sparkling jewel around his neck. If it weren't for it, the nobles wouldn't be so shocked. The jewel attached to it was a ruby that was exactly the same color as his eyes. The nobles continued to whisper among themselves. He was also wearing a red brooch. Perhaps this was a declaration that he would not hide anymore. Kalian had transformed into a flawless prince, and he confidently smiled when facing these prying nobles directly. Yen saw that everyone's attention was focused on Kalian and felt strange, so he leaned into his ear and whispered, "Your Highness, what's wrong with everyone? Everyone is looking at your outfit. I don't understand if there is a problem or not." When Kalian hadn't responded yet, Yen answered himself, "Just like I thought. Is it because you look so beautiful in that outfit? Slake will be happy to see it." Seeing Yan's cheerful expression, Kalian can only sigh. He smacked his lips and grumbled. They were looking at him and wondering why the third prince like me was wearing jewelry like this. Do you know how difficult it was for me to stop him from doing this or that? Luckily, it's only up to this point. If I put all that jewelry on, it would look even more hideous. Even though Kalian nagged me, Yen still didn't give up. "Ah, but you look handsome, okay? I bet they didn't have any intention at all and just carelessly chose that pin. That's probably what the blind cat and fried fish were like." When Yen and Kalian went to the second floor of the palace, Kalian suddenly became curious and asked Yen, "By the way Yen, you said your family is also in Kairesis." Yen immediately replied, "So you still remember what about that?" He hesitantly told me, "My sister and father had already returned home, the rest were living in Kairesis." Kalian asked again, "So did they ever visit the royal palace?" Yen nodded and replied but seemed hesitant, "If I receive an invitation then yes." Right after that he tried to change the subject and asked Kalian, "By the way, when should I move Raven to the royal garden?" Kalian immediately understood Yen's thoughts. It seemed like he didn't want to answer. Kalian shrugged and shook his head, thinking to himself, "Well, there are things that should not be mentioned." After that, he followed suit and changed the subject. "Now let's wait a little longer and see what happens." Kalian stood on the second floor looking down at the banquet hall intently and said to Yen, "You see, I want to meet someone." Yen happily shouted as if he wanted to see what Kalian's lover meant, "Hey yes, who do you want to meet?" Instead of giving Yen an answer, Kalian asked the question, "Do you know why the ballroom is called Siegfried Hall?" Yen looked at him bewildered. Of course he knew. Siegfried Hall, which is considered the most beautiful building on campus, is a large oval banquet hall supported by platinum-plated columns and crystal walls that, when lit at night, resemble like a world inside a brilliant shimmering gem. It got its name because it was named after the Siegfried family, one of the two greatest knight families in the Kairos along with Marquis Brisson, who the founder and first patriarch of the family was Duke Quickros Han Siegfried, one of the 8 heroes of the Battle of the Gods. Until now, Siegfried is still the only ducal family in Kairos. Despite their strong power, they have always been loyal to the royal family for the past 500 years. The Siegfried family owns a very large estate in the south of Kairos, which was once the residence of Sisfanian. Their symbol is the war elephant, and they still single-mindedly protect Sisfanian's territory. The more Kalian thought, the more excited he became. "When I was a child, I was very impressed with this story." Yen whispered to Kalian as if he was afraid someone would hear, Your Highness, is that the person you want to meet?" Kalian excitedly nodded and immediately nodded, "That's right, the person they wanted to meet was." At that moment a crisp laugh rang out in the banquet hall, "Aha ha ha ha." After a song was hummed in the crystal hall, a man burst into laughter and said, "The summer night in Siegfried is truly an immortal song." Yen frowned and looked down and whispered in Kalian's ear. Coincidentally, he was present at this moment, Duke Slayman Han Siegfried. The great man, the pillar of the Kairos kingdom, the current head of the Siegfried family and one of the continent's 5 sword masters was happily asking everyone, "Am I right? Ha ha ha." The crowd immediately burst into laughter along with him. Kalian couldn't take his eyes off Slayman, such an old loyal family, just the type of person he liked. Of course, Kalian never forgot the Duke's loyalty was to the king, but what Kalian was interested in was the king. To him was that deep and primordial devotion. Kalian got excited and unleashed a blast of swordsman's aura, thinking, "Should I, then, test his sharpness?" Right after that, that very small aura caught the Slayman's attention. In a place like this, it must be unusual for someone to use a swordsman's aura. Slayman immediately turned his head to look at the direction that aura was coming from, his eyebrows furrowed as if he was wary of someone who wanted to cause trouble. Slayman quickly determined that it was Kalian. When he saw that it was the third prince, Slayman's wariness disappeared, replaced by an indescribable curiosity. What kind of aura is that? He has never even held a sword. Yet he has the qualities of a knight. Kalyan stopped his hand and felt even more excited. As expected, he found himself immediately, just letting go a little. Yen also noticed Slayman's eyes staring at Kalyan. He whispered, "It seems Duke Siegfried is interested in you." Kalyan calmly glanced down. Of course he knew why he's interested in me again. After all, he is one of the 5 sword saints on this continent. He won't be petty just because I provoke him a little like that. After a moment of silence, Kalyan told Yen, "I am truly grateful, but it is still too early to become friends with him." Right after that, Kalyan turned and left and did not forget to tell Yen, "Just pretend we don't notice." When Kalyan and Yen left the second-floor hallway, Slayman still didn't take his eyes off that spot. It seemed like he was paying attention to something else. In the middle of the banquet hall at this time, Romain and Celise were raising their glasses and the party started with the king's thank you speech. "Thank you everyone for coming to celebrate, let's enjoy this night, for Kairos." Kalyan and Yen only stayed for half an hour before secretly leaving the party area by climbing down from the second-floor balcony. Yen had prepared Raven to wait for them there. Kalyan got on the horse, smiled happily and played with the raven's mane. The raven did not protest when Kalyan stroked the horse's mane. He immediately praised the raven. It was true that the raven was very obedient and gentle. Yen looked at the horse. "Be obedient to your master without feeling resentful, don't be fooled when he's not here, ha." Kalyan burst out laughing and continued praising Raven, making Raven's face swell up. Looking at Raven's agility, you could see that she was very smart and obedient. After a few conversations with Yen, he approached the gate. In the palace itself, a few guards passing by saw Kalyan and bowed respectfully. Yen and Kalyan stood at the front gate for quite a while. Yen curiously asked Kalyan, "We just need to get to the front door." Kalyan immediately nodded, "Well, while waiting here." At this moment, there was a commotion outside the palace gate. The guards were stopping someone and saying, "Without an invitation, you cannot enter." The next voice seemed to belong to the person being blocked at the gate. "I came from far away to participate in the festival." The guard standing in front of the gate reacted very quickly. 2 people stood blocking the front gate. The remaining few people formed a siege ready to wait for orders, but in the darkness, the identity of the guest was still unknown. The Kalyan wanted to go straight. Arrived at the front gate, but he decided to check the situation first. If he ran out and it wasn't Elon, the guards would probably find it unusual. Kalyan looked expectantly, waiting for the other person to declare his identity to the guards, hoping it was him. Kalyan knew Elon was nearly 50 years old, so the youthful voice he heard earlier made him nervous, until that person spoke up again. "Are you sure you don't want to give me just a card?" Entering the void, evil is Elon Manisil.